Hello everyone, welcome to Journalism 2050. This is a podcast about the future of the free press. Over the course of the next 10 episodes, we're going to be hearing from the finest minds in journalism. We're also going to be hearing from people like entrepreneurs, political scientists, and futurists who can help us figure out our present moment.
President Kennedy died.
Hi, I'm Betsy Moraes. I'm the editor of the Columbia Journalism Review, and welcome to a live taping of Journalism 2050, which is a podcast collaboration between Columbia Journalism Review and the Tao Center for Digital Journalism. This is the coolest thing we've ever done, so thank you for being here. And when we're done talking, there will be sandwiches and wine, so we hope you'll stay to the end. I'm thrilled to introduce the hosts of our show, Emily Bell, who runs the Tao Center, and Heather Chaplin, who is the founding director of journalism and design at the New School. And today they will be joined by Azmat Khan, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Columbia Journalism professor, and director of the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism, and Anya Schiffrin, a professor at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, who is also the co-director of the Technology, Policy, and Innovation Concentration. The brains behind today is Amanda Derrick, CJR's podcast producer, and thank you also to Hannah Joy and Sam Earle for all their work on this production. We are talking today about the past and future of journalism, how we got here, and where we're going next. What you hear today will be part of a podcast series on this subject, and we'll be examining it even more in a special issue, which you can read at CJR in December on cjr.org. And you can read that and much more by checking us out online and signing up for our daily newsletter. So thank you for being here, and I will put my mic away and hand it off to these fine people.
Thank you so much, Betsy. Also, I'm thrilled, delighted, and slightly worried to see all of you here today. Thanks for coming to what I hope is going to be a really absorbing and I hope important conversation, actually. Heather and I have podcast for a while together, and we decided we wanted to revive our partnership around the future of journalism, because we're kind of 25 years into a digital journey, and we were thinking, well, 25 years ahead seems like too far. But actually, we think that we don't examine the past enough. Heather, you're very big on this one. And we also need to look at some of the inflection points. And this is where our friends at Azmat and Anya come in. Because when we were discussing the plan for this show, I said we really can't ignore Gaza and a moment which has completely changed journalism. And Azmat did a really extraordinary piece of work for CJR in this summer, explaining what we could be doing, and we're solutions people, aren't we, Heather?
That's a complicated question. I'm not sure I believe in solutions per se, but we definitely, I think it is so easy to get lost in the horror show of one's present sometimes that it is super important to be thinking about always what can we be doing to make it better in the future.
So why don't we start, Azmat, with just what we're going to do, I think, is hear a little bit about your work over the summer. And Anya and I have been in so many rooms talking about policy decisions over the past decade, particularly around technology platforms, particularly around how do we support journalism in different parts of the world, that it would be really great, I think, then to broaden this out into a kind of more of a sort of general policy discussion. But tell us about the report and what you found from it that you think is most important that people take away from it.
Well, Emily and Heather, thank you both for having us. I am excited about this conversation, and I really appreciate your centering or putting at the forefront the question of Gaza, which has in so many ways led to one of the most unprecedented assaults on freedom of the press, on journalists, and also on freedom of speech. And the work that we did together this summer under Betsy's excellent leadership and with CJR fellows essentially looked at the landscape of how much journalism has changed during the course of the war in Gaza, and also these incredible assaults on the lives of journalists in Gaza, these Palestinian journalists who've been killed at unprecedented levels as early as less than a month into the war. CPJ's numbers showed that they had never previously tracked killings at this scale and pace in that time period. And to see that the response to that over time was largely one particular thing, which was a number of letters, from news organizations, statements of condemnation, and the occasional slow-moving Israeli Supreme Court case for access to Gaza. So in the face of Palestinian journalists who were risking their lives to inform the world amidst a media blackout for foreign journalists to enter, you see people starving, you see them hungry, you see them reporting on the killings of their own family members, of their loved ones, of their neighbors, and being so committed to getting that out there that they put themselves at risk every day. And the response from our industry was largely one that put out letters and statements. And at some point, when the risk shifts to something that is so unprecedented, what you're doing about it should also shift, right? To match that, to meet that. At the heart of so many problems right now when it comes to crises in journalism is people not being experimental enough, not imaginative enough, letting their bar get lowered to these very base debates rather than being really ambitious. And so it was an effort to look at, obviously we need better coverage of this issue and what's happening, and we need access, but what can we be doing about that? And what can news organizations be doing? What can individual journalists be doing? And that ranges from the question of sanctions against states that are killing journalists or that are allowing this to happen. The question of, after Jamal Khashoggi was killed.
I was going to say, we've had sanctions before, right? There's been a... Yeah.
Yes, there's precedent for all of this. So we looked at the landscape of, what can and should be on the table. There's sanctions. There's the question of, the European Union is evaluating a trade agreement and whether, Israel has broken its human rights clause. And are they looking at the killings of journalists? And according to CPJ, at least 26 journalists killed whom they've identified as deliberately targeted, and many others would argue a larger number than that. But it's really hard to have that proof when you don't have access on the ground, when work that is being documented on the ground is being destroyed. The evidence is both being bulldozed in many cases, but also just the archiving of that work digitally.
I don't know how many news organisations have stated in line during their coverage that access is not possible for actually getting into Gaza. That access is not possible to get in from the outside, which I thought was an interesting part of the actual report that people don't think about, which is what happens when you can't get journalists into a country, which we know, there are many examples of that, and I think we're seeing it in other places like Sudan, etc. at the moment, which is a sort of slightly different case. But again, we're kind of, do we think that, Heather and I were talking about this earlier, about is this something which is now, I think we think about Gaza as a very remote example. Heather, you talked about it as being the most extreme example.
Well, in the continuum of bad things happening within journalism, journalists getting murdered seems, the far end of the spectrum. But what I find myself wondering is, as you talk about how it's unprecedented and the sort of sinister quality of this being the new normal, is the why. Well, what are the conditions that are allowing this to happen and for it to play out this way?
I think it ties into so many of these topics, which is Palestinian journalists are largely discredited. They are considered, or they have been discredited in mainstream discourse. Their values and contributions are often rendered into allegations of bias and of affiliation with militant groups. And it goes beyond, this war. This is very much a post 9/11 phenomenon, right, where ordinarily we would look at someone and say, well, you're guilty, you're innocent until proven guilty. And that has 9/11 very much reversed that sort of understanding. When there is, a claim of terrorism or linked to a terrorist organization, all of a sudden it flips where you are guilty unless you can prove yourself innocent. And the thresholds used are so different than what we would use. Like the threshold to prove yourself innocent is so much higher than the threshold used for the intelligence to dub you guilty. And that guilt is essentially the legal threshold that is used for an assassination, for rendering a killing acceptable. And people are afraid to speak out because they will look like they are defending people associated with militant groups. They are afraid of advocating for them because it will impugn their journalism. They are terrified of being grouped together and discredited. And it's very much, even now when we talk about foreign journalists not being able to get in, there are local journalists documenting things. And yet, like, the way their coverage is scrutinized, when I have to tell you, I've spent, many years investigating airstrikes on the ground in countries like Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. And in many of these places, in Afghanistan, it's like rural countryside, there's very little internet. Everyone I spoke to, almost no one said they'd ever spoken to a journalist before. In Iraq and Syria, ISIS banned the use of the internet, and information would trickle out. But journalists were famously decapitated. American foreign journalists and British journalists were decapitated. So there weren't local journalists in these places carrying out this work. And yet, in Gaza, unlike any other place I've ever reported, there is such an ethos and a culture for documentation. When you ask kids growing up there, what do you want to be when you grow up? Here you will get answers like doctor, lawyer, different kinds of things, policeman, woman, firefighter. In Gaza, people will often say journalism because that documentation is such a part of the ethos. They've had to document atrocities or they won't be believed.
It's super interesting, and the point you make about the culture of documentation, if I can follow up on that for a sec, it's one thing for us in the States to lament what's happening to journalists in Gaza and to think about what that means for our ability to understand what's happening there. But I do often find myself wondering, for Gazans, how are they getting their news? How is news and information that's reliable continuing to circulate? And if so, how?
Yeah, it's a challenge consistently because of internet. So people will often go to these charging stations. And by the way, there have been strikes on charging stations, but people will go to great lengths to go plug in their phone and get internet. In fact, one of these beachfront cafes where many people would go to get internet a few months ago was struck, and a number of journalists and graphic artists were killed, but it's already an endeavor to go get it, to go get internet, to plug in, to upload, to download. One of the, not just beachfront cafes, I talked to a source at Nasser Hospital all of the time, and he would talk to me from this stairway where there was great internet. And, we would video call, and, we would talk about what was happening. In August 25th, I believe, Israel struck Nasser Hospital, and that very stairway, more than twice actually, this was where journalists were doing this exact thing, where two Reuters camera operators were doing their live filming. And so that news, they put it out through the internet, and it circulates amongst people over the apps they use most, WhatsApp groups, Facebook.
So non-professionals are putting it out.
Professionals. There's so many professionals. They're putting it out, but so many others are too. And what I will say is, internet is not the only way they get news. So by virtue of having to go walk for water and meet up in these places, people often carry news with them. There is, there's a lot of, and I think a lot about like these woven structures that often get ignored, which is in the absence of a government where there's no police force. Like, people have to run their own safety, their own, and so these informal groups follow, and a lot of information is communicated that way.
Anya, I want to bring you in here as well, because go back as far as you like, but how did we get here? How did we get to a position where you can have this existential threat to journalism in one conflict, which also seems now a playbook for everywhere else, including potentially America, where you have the discrediting and the calling the use of the word terrorist. You have the talk of visas being withdrawn, etc. This is a very weak version of the things that we're seeing in Gaza. But the playbook seems established, but there's a historic precedent for this. I know you've got some thoughts about how we ended up here.
Well, I mean, I think right now
You have 5 minutes.
I think where we are right now is where we all know where we are, which is you've got these autocrats and authoritarian rulers all over the world, and discrediting the media, discrediting universities, making populist promises that they don't necessarily keep is part of what we're seeing. So I think it's a global contagion problem. And, you know, we used to look at countries like Venezuela or Turkey or Hungary and say, wow, this is terrible. Media capture is such a problem. And by that I mean government working in cahoots with media owners to put out a certain message. And now we see that this problem has really spread everywhere. I mean, obviously, Azmat's a very hard act to follow. You've described the brutality, but let's also not forget what Netanyahu has done to the free press and the public broadcasters in Israel. So first you kind of shut down independent voices, and then as you point out, you can get away with murder under cover of darkness. And it's reminding me, listening to you reminded me of my book Global Muckraking, because there we looked at independent and investigative journalism in the global south in the 19th century. And in those days, it took forever for things to come out. So Adam Hochschulz wrote about how it took us 10 years to find out what was going on in the Belgian Congo under King Leopold. And it used to take forever. And now I thought that with digital media and social media, that problem was solved, that you couldn't actually shut places off and information would leak out. But what you're saying is that you actually still can shut places off. And that's really kind of shocking.
You can shut places off with threat and with willingness to do physical violence and with profiling and targeting. I mean, I think we can talk a little bit as well about the role of technology. This is something else that you've looked at, Anya. What do we think about why is it a cultural or political problem that the current class of press owners have not met the moment and haven't sort of called out not just this existential threat to journalism, but I'm British. The BBC is in a terrible state this week. I belong to a number of chat groups with former executives and academics who've been attached to the BBC. And from some way back, I was saying, I think it's pretty obvious what is going to happen here, which is you're going to get a lawsuit from Donald Trump because you badly edited a programme. And then if you don't meet him with some concession, then you'll find that you can't operate in the States. And I think that, even in the UK, there was that's not going to happen because it's not really legal to do that. And it's like, well...
People always think it's not going to happen until it happens.
Right, yeah. Yes.
I mean, I don't want to cut you off, but I was just thinking, to go back a little bit and give us some historical precedences, are there other moments that you find yourself, like specific moments you really find yourself thinking about as we witness what's happening now?
Oh, sure. I mean...
Give us like 2.
Yeah.
Or 3.
or 1.
Well, there's lots of memoirs of people traveling in the Soviet Union or, living in Germany in the early 1930s who talk about the sort of disappearance of titles, right? So many people have written about, I went to my newsstand and all of a sudden it was gone. I grew up in New York City, and my dad talks about that during the McCarthy era, that there were places in Times Square where you get all these magazines and suddenly they weren't there anymore. And he always talks about how when the UK started the National Health Service, my dad went to the British Consul Library or something to read the Manchester Guardian because there just wasn't information. And then he went to Yale, and nobody ever talked about politics at all in the 1950s. As you also know, I've written a lot about Clyde Miller and the Institute for Propaganda Analysis here at Columbia Teachers College. And in the 1930s, they set up a media literacy program to counter propaganda, and they sent leaflets and brochures to teachers, and they had little sort of emojis even showing propaganda techniques, and they were shut down in 1942, and Clyde Miller, I think, was investigated by the Dyes Commission, so that was a shutting down. So when all of those attacks on the disinformation researchers came about a few years ago, I thought, well, this is so much like what has happened. So
can you draw a direct line articulating something disappearing from the newsstand in New York to Palestinian reporters being murdered in Gaza?
Well, I think it's also related to the other problem. I saw Natalia Antalava speaking recently, and she said, we kind of misunderstood the misinfo problem, because it isn't just focusing on pieces of false content, which has obviously been a huge question of what's happening today, but it's also that overpowering miasma of confusion where nobody knows what to believe anymore, nobody knows what to trust. And I was so interested, the last couple of years in my classroom where students would say, I don't know what to read on the Middle East, I don't know what to trust. One of my students came in and said, Harumph, I've stopped looking at mainstream media because of their coverage. I don't even read The Guardian anymore. And I thought, well, that's weird, because The Guardian probably covered more of what was going on
Very
than
disturbing
anyone
for me.
else.
It's like a long time.
Well, I was too.
Not the place to start with your boycott.
That's what
Emily,
I thought.
do you remember
as well.
interviewing Jason? Emily and I interviewed Jason Stanley, who wrote How Propaganda Works back in 2016,
Yes.
and he said that's the goal, is that it's not necessarily convincing people what they know and don't know, it's convincing them there's no way of knowing.
No way.
That's
Right.
right.
Yeah.
You convince people, and I find myself doing it all the time. I read this, I read that, I just can't I can't deal. Right? Because it's so overwhelming and it's so upsetting that you throw up your hands.
Yeah.
And that's the goal. I mean, that's straight out of the Nazis. It's just classic.
Yeah, Nathan Heller had a wonderful piece in the New Yorker right after the last Trump election where he just said that's the problem now. It doesn't even have to be true. You just put it out there and it takes on a life of its own, and then before you know it, everybody's muddled.
I was at a conference, so we don't spend all of our time going to conferences,
I
but
think
as academics you're kind of rewarded for it, I guess. But I went to a conference a couple of weeks ago in Canada, because they can hold conferences and we can also
Taylor's
we can all speak freely there. And there's a wonderful MEP called Alexandra Geese, like the trendy band from Brooklyn, and she is a Green MP for Germany, and she actually talked about, so everyone says, look at Europe, they're doing all these amazing things to prop up, and she said, do you know what? None of this is worth anything if there's no enforcement. And I think this comes back to that fear about, we're seeing in Europe, for instance, the DSA, Digital Services Act, which is meant to be providing some kind of transparency and control over American platforms, but there's no enforcement. Because people are scared. JD Vance goes to the security conference in Munich and says, you are not going to stop our platforms. I mean, to what extent does, I do get a bit red string conspiracy theorist about this, but to what extent, Azmat, because you look at OSINT as well, to what extent should we really be concerned about that level of I guess, kind of concentration of power in the platforms as well as, and the technologies as well as the states? Who is driving that particular vehicle at the moment?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a great question. And I think back to, when I was first investigating the air war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and this vast civilian toll that had been kept from us, I needed to access satellite imagery and of areas that were actually blocked in Google Maps at the time because of this obscure law from, I think, 1991 that banned high-resolution satellite imagery from Israel for American satellite service providers of high-resolution imagery. And as a result, large parts of the Middle East were blocked out. And it was just very hard to get high-quality, historic satellite imagery to look at before and afters. And I wound up using this subscription-based site. It was called TerraServer, and I think I paid like $50 a month for this membership for very high-resolution, like beautiful imagery. And then all of a sudden one day, this thing that I'd relied on that helped me for 2 years and to do this massive investigation called The Uncounted, it was gone. It was bought, I think, by a hedge fund, if I'm remembering correctly.
Oh, the hedge funds.
The hedge funds. We have some thoughts about those. Another episode, yeah.
And it was such an example, like throughout, like we need high-resolution historic satellite imagery for incredible human rights documentation. And this obscure law from 1990, which has since been undone, so I can actually use Google Maps now, or Google Earth, I should say, for historic satellite imagery from some of these places. It's not perfect, but it is far better than it was before. But it was in the hands of these congressional leaders who passed this bizarre law for one country and no other, coupled with, defense contractors are often the ones with the biggest relationships with satellite imagery providers, which a lot of OSINT reporters rely on. And so I remember during the war against ISIS, I would have to ask these companies that had great, their main providers are the governments doing these bombings for access for a particular reason, and I would often get told no. Whereas if you ask them for, satellite imagery from Bucha and Russian aggression there and crimes there, like, you're more likely to. So it is very politicized. I think the weaponization, to kind of bring this back to your question, which is, how much should journalists be doing? I think we, as always, have to adapt with the constraints and obstacles we're facing. And I know a lot of journalists these days who they think about laws and legality, and they will create a record of, what they're documenting and make it public, the underlying material public, so that others may also use it, and it's part of that transparency. I do it with the documents I uncover. I make them public, or that I sue the Pentagon for. There's that part of it, and then there's also this understanding that all of this could go at any day. What you put up, it could be not archived, it could be not preserved, and to what extent do we have a responsibility? I think it's the site we use a lot, if you're trying to get behind a paywall, Archive Today it's called. It's archive.is. I think the other day, the federal government put forth, I want to get this right, so I don't want to misquote what happened exactly, but they asked for details about its founder, and like one of the most important essential archiving tools is under threat.
And we've seen that as well with the Internet Archive. We've seen that as AI crawlers become ubiquitous, you would think, well, all of this stuff is being gathered somewhere, but of course it's not gathered in a way that's accessible to us. It's gathered in the training models, and it means that the actually accessible sites out there are putting up walls. So this, what my friend Heather would call a wicked problem, becomes much more wicked.
Well, it's interesting, this archiving thing, I feel like keeps coming up. At Journalism Design Lab, we build really grassroots news networks, like very sort of low to the ground networks, informal networks. And we've done some research recently looking at, are there sort of typical ways that wherever you go, are there roles that people play to keep the news and information circulating? And archivist is one of the roles that comes up again and again, that wherever you go, in whatever neighborhood, there is some lady or some guy who is archiving the whether she keeps all the eviction notices, or she keeps all of if there's a certain landlord who everyone knows is not doing such a good job, she keeps every court record filed against him. She just has them in her house. Wherever you go, you find this, and I feel like I don't know if I'm listening for it, but I keep hearing this again and again. And it scares me that we have actually gotten to a moment historically where we are having to think, what is the political reality of being able to hold on to your own past, right? And what does it mean that we are living in a society where that's under threat?
And I think in Europe, all people talk about now is tech sovereignty and how can we build our own platforms and how can we get away from the US. That is the number one subject that just keeps coming up. And what that's going to look like is unclear, but it's definitely the conversation everyone's having. Sorry, Azmat, you were about to say something.
No. I'm really struck by that and just wish that was the ethos we were surrounded in. There's a brilliant graduate of the journalism school. Her name is Laila Hassan, brilliant journalist. She did a really powerful story about the race to preserve evidence of war crimes in Gaza for DropSite News, and it was very deeply reported, and it kind of told it through this cascading, from the people who chronicle it to the people who upload it to the people who collect these drives and try to bring them across a border. And it has me thinking about, back to what you're saying, which is we're not just worried about the preservation of it, but for those who keep it, right? It's not just making it available, it's those who keep it and the risks they take to do so, right? The ways in which I know, so I just saw the other day that YouTube wiped videos of several prominent human rights organizations that operate in Palestinian territories. I think as many as 700 of these really important videos. I work in these same areas, at least in the West Bank, and have seen the extent to which researchers from this organization Al-Haq go to document on the ground, and it's truly impressive. And they have great OSINT techniques. And remember one day I saw somebody from Al-Haq, and I was showing them these weapons fragments from Tulkarm, and they'd gone through these trainings, and he's like, I know that's a JDAM. And I just confirmed earlier, they're really good, and they're putting it out for the world and documenting this stuff, and yet all of a sudden, out of nowhere, nobody even noticed that because they've now been added to a sanctions list at Israel's behest, even though the CIA had previously said they had no evidence they had any affiliation with any, of what was alleged against them. It's really a testament to how good they are on the ground, in my view. But all of a sudden, these videos disappear. There's no mention of it. You find out later, and it's like, oh, did anyone? And now, if somebody holds that content, are they at risk?
Well, and what we find with our work, it keeps coming up here in the States and in just local communities. There's no legal framework for them. So I'm on the phone with people who provide counseling for journalists around legal issues. They're like, because is this person a journalist? But then they're not really students. So what's the legal framework to say that one day a government agency can't show up and take it all, or even if it's a frivolous lawsuit, wreck their lives with frivolous lawsuit. So anyone who's listening, we need a new legal framework.
Google has these automated means of looking at what's stored on your drives. I remember one day, all these airstrike videos that I had saved from the US government and also from ISIS propaganda, both had been wiped from my drives. And I'd gotten these emails. I found them later, and it said, this material has been moved for violating our, I don't want to get the words right, it was something like terroristic guidelines. It was something like that.
This is your Google Drive.
Yes, and I had to contact people, people high up, and they were like, "Oh, sorry, it's been undone."
Yes.
But it wasn't a mistake. It was that they do this. They use AI to scrape and see. Oh, this is I don't know why the coalition videos were tagged, but they're U.S. government videos that show you this. The view of this airstrike. Tons of these videos were gone. I understood that the ISIS logo, the Amaq logo, okay, that might happen. I'm not disseminating it. I'm using it for journalistic purposes. It is private. But both they used AI to find them, and they were all gone.
I think
I got them reinstated.
This is something we don't talk about nearly enough in terms of AI, and actually how it's used on us as a surveillance tool so much more effectively than we can use it yet in the field of journalism. I'm kind of quite a fan. I think when you were talking about how we build our own technologies, I'm from the very early phase of digital news, and everyone's like, we should build our own tech, and it would take forever, cost a fortune, would break, and you'd all end up on Google or something like that. Whereas actually now, I'm like, I don't know that some of us who said these technologies are just incompatible with doing journalism, I think we kind of gave up on that and said, it'll be fine. So it very much feels like it hasn't been fine, and maybe one of the things that we can use low-cost technologies for is to build much better. Is that a bizarre and stupid idea?
What I was just going to say, actually, historically, is that another thing that we found in the Global Muckraking book was how many times the journalism that was produced had no impact at the moment, but was used later in trials. So I have many examples. For example, in Chile, there was a journalist who documented the killings after Pinochet took over. All around the country, Allende officials and military people went to turn themselves in, and some of the top people in Pinochet's military flew around the country and assassinated all of them in their cells that night, and then put little articles in the paper saying, shot trying to escape. And later on, when there were trials, that was used. South Africa, some of the reporting under apartheid was later used. Clearly the coverage of the famine in Ukraine later on. So I do think what you're saying is really important. And we've actually been having conversations over at my part of Columbia because one of our student journalists asked the current editors of the Morningside Post to take down something he'd written that was critical of Trump in 2017. And so I sort of wondered, well, what's best practice? That seems, so I used this as a teachable moment, called lots of people, including Sheila, and sort of asked, and archivists, including Istvan Rev in Budapest, and of course learned that the guidance from the sort of official Student Journalism Association in this country has now changed. Adelina Yankova, our PhD student, came over to talk about it. So I think people are very aware of the risks of the archives, and people think of our, Istvan pointed out, people think of archive as the static collection, and it's really, it's not. It's political and it means something. Can people build their own tech? I'm not a technologist, so I don't know. I mean, I worry that if we're thinking about democracy, more fragmentation and more polarization, may not help. Can we just say Google's a public utility and has to be regulated as such? But will they listen? And over again, people are saying, no, they don't actually listen. They don't turn in information. They don't respond to regulators. They don't pay their fines. So we let them get too big, clearly, and that's dangerous for everybody, I think.
This is a really nice segue, because I know we're starting to run out of time, into what are the levers for change. In my worst moments, in my darker moments, I think, what are the chances for good policy, considering the sort of rise of authoritarianism? But on the other hand, I don't see a way out without it. So what do you think? Is policy a lever for change? And if so, what should we be doing?
Because I was going to say, Azmat just had a whole conference on solutions and how to help. So I don't know if you want
Well, I'm going to ask her next.
Okay. Well, I think we're slightly. So I think the one thing that cheers me up is there's great policies all over the world for how you can help journalism. I think that our community, I feel like Emily and I have been looking at this really for more than a decade. And now everybody else is interested too.
I know. We're both thrilled and also slightly annoyed.
It's the good thing about being a lifelong pessimist in 2025 is suddenly you're...
I think it's great, right? So in the U.S. you have people like Steve Waldman looking at sort of little things like tax credits for businesses that advertise in local news, or vouchers, or credits for hiring journalists. So that's one thing. If you're Europe, then you can do really broad things, right? So you can do massive subsidies. In France, for example, the newsstand problem was solved. If you want a license for a newsstand, you have to stock something like 40 publications. You have your must carry, your non-discrimination. The Danes or whoever used to subsidize the second largest paper in each town to make sure there was a plurality. Now they're targeting on news deserts. So all over the world, there's great policies. And I know in so many of the rooms we've been in, the Africans and the Latin Americans say, no, 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 we don't trust our government. We don't want them anywhere in this. And the Americans used to say that too. But I feel like the lesson of Trump is it doesn't, if you have a Trump, everything's going to get ruined.
Exactly.
So I'm less worried about the perfect law. And I know I've said this to Rasmus many a time. I teach at a policy school. Everything is a trade-off. If we give subsidies for news, some bad person is definitely going to get one. That's the way it is. So it's really just trade-offs. But there's layers of oversight. There's so many systems that have been working pretty well. And I think that's it. I don't think we can ask for perfection. But I think there's a lot that can be done. And I feel like our community has learned. And I feel like the next generation has listened to these conversations. So I feel like there's a lot of good things and good possibilities.
And not specifically about policy, but just from your perspective, do you see any one or two levers of change that you think really have the most potential?
Well, I just wanted, before I mention two levers, I think to something our amazing colleague Sheila Cornell, had said.
She's just there.
She's just here.
I've forgotten.
But lessons learned from the Philippines and elsewhere, where when there's rising authoritarianism, what have been the appropriate responses? What are trends? What have been lessons learned? And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, one of the first things you called out, Sheila, was just that the sooner people organize and collectively resist, the better chance you have. And I think journalism is one of these very strange fields where advocacy is eschewed in many ways. We have certain means of it, or there are press freedom groups that will do the advocacy portion, and it's interpreted as though we don't involve ourselves in that. That's not actually true. There means, you can see the great ways in which the Wall Street Journal advocated for one of their own, Evan Gershkovich, after he was unfairly prosecuted in Russia and accused of crimes that he is not involved in as this journalist, and the work that he did. There is evidence that they can act, but I do think that given, again, when the precedent changes, when the threat level changes, your actions also have to shift with it. And so, the very first thing I think is that these news organizations should collectively be organizing across the spectrum. Like, I think that the Washington Free Beacon and the National Journal and Dropsite News, they have some commonality, right? And shared values and ethos. And what is the bare bones minimum that they should be organizing around? And are they doing that? Or are we so bifurcated that that meeting of the minds cannot happen? Are we, I think there's a journalist for Fox News who has been quite outspoken about the killings of journalists in Gaza. His name is Trey Yingst. And, there are different people who have spoken up, and I think that not forgetting that commonality and that overlapping shared values to act quickly, because I've seen the precedent it has set when it comes to Gaza and what we've allowed. Like, Romesa Osterg, this tough student, was picked up off the street like she was kidnapped, coming home from iftar, coming on her way to iftar, and for writing an op-ed. And that, sure, there were people that were upset by that, but look at the response. Look at the vilification of students who have been picked up and accused of these heinous crimes, and look at how many people have said, yes, they should be deported. People who otherwise, when it came to some other conflict, were the ADL and other organizations that, proclaimed to fight for civil liberties, right? Like, all of these things fall apart. And so it's a question of shared values and seeing that. I think people right now in this moment are seeing cancel culture affect them in an era when, it didn't previously. At least, what are these shared values now about freedom of the speech? I will also say that just a real commitment towards the core of great journalism. So training people.
Iron core of journalism.
Yes, everybody should be trained. I was just talking to some students about this. You should learn these OSINT skills. People think of that as a separate form of journalism. I see it as just journalism that you've already been doing, just advanced for the times. You integrate them. You don't exclusively only use them. But everyone needs to up their game in terms of their reporting. I think that we need to collaborate more with people who are computer scientists and others who can experiment and be more imaginative. And I could go on and on, but I would encourage people to read that Columbia Journalism Review article, Urgent Ideas for Press Freedom in Gaza, that gets specific about that. But if I had to boil it down to one or two lessons for everyone, it's being really imaginative, throwing ideas out there for discussion, and then experimenting. We need pilots, we need experiments, we need people who are willing to be game, and I'm grateful for you guys for bringing us together.
It's tricky. I've written about this, about the need for being more imaginative and more experimental, but it's a psychological challenge because I think in moments like the historical one we're now, it's people's instinct to batten the hatches. Totally. So asking people, we know you're afraid, we know it feels like there's no margin for error, but this is when you have to be willing to be imaginative. It's a challenge.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are buckling down in this moment. They're feeling that pressure. And news organizations, because their credibility is coming under attack from so many different sides, that they're just trying to hold on to some semblance of everything. But it's honestly, I think about this a lot. What are your creative ideas?
We have to, so we do kind of have to stop. But
Anya has to leave.
I absolutely don't want to. But I do think that actually just on that last point, Azmat, which is, I think that this is great for young journalists. Really great I want my son as a journalist. He went out to a workshop the other day around political organisation. I was like, be really careful that you don't, in that way that you do when you're a mother and you give your children bad advice. But also that I was thinking, no, actually, this is actually exactly the skills that we need now. And there's something great about seeing our students, and I think, kind of the people that you work with in community colleges, being really energised. And I think in newsrooms, I see people who are very beaten down and worn out. And I'm like, we need to find a way as well to kind of bring that energy in here, I think.
Good.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for that conversation. We're going to, and thank you all actually for being here. We're going to carry on. If anyone wants to stay and ask questions, we're going to kind of just carry on with the cameras rolling.
Despite being a researcher on the podcast, this is an implant question.
It's not capture.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking, because we're working on this podcast, is we've been talking about the effect that the internet had on journalism, and one of the things that it did was it was supposed to be in an empowering way. It blurred the line between a civilian and a journalist, and this was seen as a great thing. Anyone could report for themselves and for their local community. But then with Gaza, you really see how dangerous it can be to have the category of a journalist blurred to the point where it can be discredited. And, we now are in a moment when journalism can be both discredited as a category, but also claimed to so easily. So even Elon Musk has defined himself as a citizen journalist at one point. I think in Gaza, they don't let journalists in, except in a cynical way where sometimes, I know there was a British far-right commentator who, Douglas Murray, who has appeared in Gaza wearing press uniform and been interviewed, so it's kind of claiming the authority of a journalist, but it's being weaponized in a cynical way. And so I wondered how important it is for journalists to define their profession, or should we embrace the blurring of that category? Who decides what a journalist is? Should it be journalists standing up for who they see as their peers? Without wanting to get too philosophical, it's kind of what is a journalist now?
I love philosophy.
We love philosophy. Yeah, if we don't have at least one philosopher per episode, Heather gets very upset. But I think this is a great question about, because I was part of the internet era, which said opening the category is actually incredibly healthy for journalism.
Well, I think it actually applies to other conflicts more than it does to Gaza, because again, I want to say there are some of the most professionally trained journalists in Gaza than any conflict zone I've ever been in before. And that citizen journalist category, yes, there are people like documenting things, but actually at this stage with what's happening in Gaza, to have quality internet, to have these materials, to have the means to live broadcast, you do tend to be somebody with the Reuters operation or with this, Al Jazeera, to do the work where we're getting a lot of that content. It is coming from professional journalists. So I want to make that distinction, but I think the question is a good one, irrespective of whether or not we're talking about Gaza. I think what we need are journalists who are better trained at verifying that content, and platforms. I'm pretty sure, I would imagine in this era of just burgeoning disinformation and means to disseminate it and reproduce it, that we are going to probably have some platform or some shared commonality of verified content or means through which, there's language for this, for cryptology of how, things are going to emerge that we know or can verify. And so I think it requires, yes, we want more people documenting things, but we also want we want platforms that allow us to verify that, and then journalists who are really discerning and sharp in using that. I think we've had a ton of content come out of Gaza, and yet how much of it makes it into these news organizations? Who do we trust? And so I think it's an issue of verification, trust, and all of the...
Historically, the U.S., of course, has resisted definitions and licensing, whereas in Europe, they've always had very strict rules about, if you've been to these journalism schools or you've worked at those outlets. I think sometimes in the policy world, defining journalism becomes an excuse not to do any funding, because people who don't want to do any funding go, ooh, we have to think for a couple of years about what is a journalist, and then it becomes just a...
we don't want to give them any money.
It's a stalling technique, but I was I'm planning our next Saving Journalism conference, which obviously everyone's invited to on March 20th. And I was just reading a report on how some of the European countries are now regulating influencers, but for for fraud reasons, right? And advertising disclosure. So I think that probably one of the questions will be, is there money involved? Are you selling something? Are you getting money from somebody? And then that also adds a whole new layer.
What are the pros? How do you think about the pros and cons of those two different approaches? European versus America, defining versus not defining.
I think defining is sort of, Sheila and I, when we taught our journalism and film course, world's best class, except for the one I taught with Emily, you remember we talked about that.
Sounds like more fun than the one we taught, actually.
It was awfully fun. That was in it too, right? One or two movies a week and then discuss it. Remember, we sort of landed on this, it's a process, right? That was where we kind of got with that.
With the Committee to Protect Journalists, we never define who a journalist is. We just say we know it when we see it.
You know it when you see it. Yeah. Well, this comes back to this sort of like if we're on the ground.
I think that's the right way because it's an ever-expanding world of data.
And who works with who, I think, is I was talking to a news influencer who said, I'm really careful about who I work with because not everybody has the same standards as me. And I thought, well, it's quite interesting that sort of this new world that's emerging says we have certain, we actually do have certain standards. And that comes down to how do you build these networks of resilience.
I mean, I think it's going to have to be more expansive, our view.
But I also think, the structures that we built to protect press freedom, etc., dating back to I don't know when. So I think because the press has changed so much, whether they're still relevant or whether we need more, press associations, press freedom protection groups, advocacy groups, etc. Do these suffice in the current moment, or even Columbia Journalism Review,
they
journalism
don't.
schools, that whole infrastructure of legal support, etc. Are they enough, or is it more like we're putting a finger in the dike, which is going to explode eventually?
I think they're not enough. Again, the work I'm mostly involved with is very, very grassroots. It's ordinary people in their neighborhood sort of stepping in to do the informal news collection and dissemination and sharing, and there is no support for them and no legal framework.
When they get support and they get sued, for example, who comes to support
This is what keeps me up at night, and I'm constantly trying to get legal opinions, and every single person I talk to goes, that's interesting. And I'm like, that's not really what I want to hear.
A Substacker gets sued for libel.
Right. And what I'm starting to investigate is that there might be legal frameworks that community activists are more familiar with. Because a lot of the people in art networks, they are disseminating the news verbally or in a live way, so it's not even published. So then how does that change it? It's
we do
tricky.
have a piece in the issue, the Journalism 2050 issue, about Perez Hilton.
Oh my God.
And how the Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni drama has to do with all this. Because Blake Lively sued or tried to subpoena Perez Hilton, who wanted to take advantage of the very good shield laws in Nevada. And so Joel Simon has written about this and why it actually behooves journalists of all kinds to broaden the definition of who should be protected. Yeah.
Yes.
How we got here and where we're going.
That's how we got here and where we're going. And nobody mentions.
Is he going to be a guest?
And the ground zero of all of this. But yes,
so you can read more about it in CJR.
We've actually now lost. We've actually now lost a part of our podcast. So it kind of like maybe is a time now that we kind of just break and say thanks very much.
Sandwich time,
everyone. It's sandwich time.
And thank you to CJR.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming. Journalism 2050 is a co-production of the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School, the Columbia Journalism Review, with help from our friends at the Journalism and Design Lab at the New School. Our producer is Amanda Darroch, our production coordinator is Hannah Joy, and our researcher is Sam Earle. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.